Now See It, Person to Person, a weekly document for television, as told by the faces and voices of people in the news. And so here I am, Sunday the 19th of July, 1998, and I'm appearing here in front of the door of the TCI facility largely for legalistic reasons. And that is that I've posted this piece of paper on the door 1 hour ago at 6:30 p.m. Now I've got a copy of it with red letters warning, "Do not ignore, immediate warning." The necessity for this is that Obviously, one tactic which they may use is to pretend that they never saw the warning. They had no idea that there was some lawsuit in effect, imminently in effect, and of course I expect them fully to lie about the situation and pretend that I said nothing of the kind. So, this has been up for an hour. That was posted at 6:30 p.m. earlier. Here, it's exactly the same document that I have here. Notice of intent to file lawsuit imminently, July 19th, 98. 6:30 p.m. delivery by hand to all whom it may concern at TCI, City of Seattle, NWA, APC. This letter should be considered a warning that the actions that were indicated 1 hour ago by TCI personnel will have the very real consequence of resulting in a lawsuit. And this was the claim that they were not going to air the program, even though I was here before 5:30, ringing the bell for a full 5 minutes. Specifically, I was told by a playback operator, a TCI playback operator, that the front door of the facility, which was locked, that I should not expect to see my program tonight aired because he did not find it in the Dropbox at 5:30. The fact, as he well knows, is that I stood at the front door ringing the doorbell for at least 5 minutes prior to 5:30 p.m., not answering the doorbell and then claiming that 5:30 that it did not arrive in time is a ridiculous assertion. As I told the personnel at the door, lying in this way removes the issue from his merely following orders and clearly puts this individual at risk of being named in a suit seeking monetary damages for his actions against my valuable property, i.e. the television program Now See It Person to Person, Kurt Cobain Was Murdered. I am completely sick of having my valuable property damaged on a regular basis by TCI personnel, and view this both as a symptom of bad management at the policy-making level and also the fault of the actions of many employees who regard their employment as an extension of their childish desires to bully people. I suggest that the crew on staff this evening consider carefully the very specific actions I will take against them legally if the situation is not remedied today. In the view of any rational person, the risk of being named in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit by someone who has absolutely no sympathy for your position greatly outweighs any personal satisfaction you may feel in asserting authority that is not your prerogative to assert. And yet, over and over again, I have seen TCI personnel, including Mr. Scowcroft, foolishly ignore these warnings to bring us to this point. I insist that you contact Mr. Scowcroft at once to gain his view on this situation. If you fail to do this, it will only further demonstrate your capricious and malicious disregard for my rights and my property. And then it is signed Richard Lee. And, the basic claim, I came here, I pulled up right there. I stood here and rang the bell for 5 minutes. I arrived at 5:24. I rang the bell until 5:29. At that point I realized that I didn't have the card stuck in the plastic slot. I walked, 15 feet that way to get the card from this carrying case, in fact. It was right in here, not hard to find. Walked back here, looked at my watch, it was still 5:29. And while I was walking up here, I heard a thud in that drop box. There's the slot, and there's the door behind the darkened glass there. And so I walked up here, I put my face close to the glass here and saw the playback operator walking away. And then he stood in that doorway there for approximately 2 minutes, talking to someone, or apparently talking to someone. And then he turned around to answer my knocking, and he came to the door, opened the door, and said, "We're not going to air your program. You weren't on time. I looked in the box at 5:30 and it wasn't there." I said, "It's 5:30 now. What time do you think it is?" And he said, "No, we're not going to air your program because I looked at 5:30. And I said, "Well, it is 5:30. I've been standing here ringing the bell for the last 5 minutes. Just like this guy here has been ringing the bell for at least 5 minutes. And they've played this game on me often. They pretend that they don't know that someone's out here waiting for them, ringing the bell. There were 2 people sitting in here when this guy started ringing the bell. And has anyone gone back to tell the personnel that someone's here at the door? No, they pretend that they can't hear the bell. And in fact, when this occurred, there was apparently a guy, Tim, up here in this upper office, because this guy who answered the door said, Oh, well, Tim, call the police. He's trespassing. Call the police right now. Call 911. This is an emergency. He's trespassing. See what I mean? So, Tim is probably still sitting up there. The other guy is still sitting over here. And in fact, it's the same guy that refused to, a couple of months ago to air the program because it was allegedly 13 minutes late. In this case, it was early, and this is just another example of TCI dirty tricks at work. And you would think that these people would know better, but time and again, what experience has proved is that they are merely interested in playing these games and, basically trying to strong arm you into a position where they say, go ahead and sue us. We're not afraid of your lawsuits. Well, that kind of an attitude has consequences. And in this particular case, obviously, the consequences will be a lawsuit for their continued and well-documented damage to my valuable property, which is my television series. They're out there now, still not answering the door. Yeah. Personnel in there, they just don't want to acknowledge that anyone's here. And it wouldn't surprise me if the guy did do a 911 call. In fact, although you have to wonder why would he even open the door if he was so terrified of the tape guy, But in no uncertain terms, I bickered with this guy for a couple of minutes, and I said, hey, it's 9:32 on my, or 5:32 on my watch right now, and, we've been talking about this for the last couple of minutes. And I know that it was 5:29 when I was walking back here. I definitely would expect this sort of a dirty trick from them. So, believe me, if they made a 911 call at the time when that guy said, the 911 call will say 9:31 or 9:30 or 5:31 or 5:32 on it. No later at all, unless of course they waited to make the call. But anyway, for the casual viewer and not someone who's viewing this in a courtroom setting, this is precisely the sort of thing that they can do to you to censor an unpopular opinion, or let's say a popular opinion that they don't agree with at TCI and by inference the city of Seattle. And, there are many means at their disposal with their phony 911 calls and their phony claims of when you arrived and their phony claims of what the regulations are as it pertains to this guy sticking his little nose in that box and not seeing something when he damn well knows I'm standing out here ringing the bell for 5 minutes. Let's ring the bell some more, just like that other guy. Let's see if we can get anyone to answer. Well, I suspect not. Answering the door is not something that they particularly inclined to do here. Hi, how are you?
Fine,
Okay. You're not TCI personnel, are you?
no, I'm not.
Oh, okay.
They're in that room up there.
Yeah, I suppose they are. Thanks.
Is that Richard Lee at my door? Is that Richard Lee?
Just a customer.
Richard, you're trespassing.
No, I'm not trespassing. This is a public facility. I am here for a specific purpose.
Richard,
I am scheduled to be here at this time.
if you don't leave, I'm calling the police.
All right, well, this is the way it's going to be, Jeff. It's going to be taped to your door like it's taped to the front door.
I'm calling the police, Richard.
I will be gone in 60 seconds. I will cause no property damage. You have nothing to fear. Except the law, of course. Because when people are criminally damaging your property, they should be in fear of the law. Thanks for including yourself in the multi-million-dollar lawsuit, Jeff. It's a real smart thing to do.
said, you stay, you birthday. And pretty soon those people were, beginning.
And this is the guy, the playback operator identified as Michael. He identified Tim as someone else who was here at the time. There's Mr. Scowcroft. And there's Jeffro, the guest star we just spoke with minutes ago from behind the closed door. Jeffro. Hi. And it is now 7:51. I'm vacating the premises.
People the way we want to be treated ourselves. They have a problem, we try to solve it. If we can't, we find someone who can. And we're not satisfied until they are. It's just like each and every customer is our only customer. Pretty simple. TCI, may I help you? And we're not satisfied until they are. It's just like each and every customer is our only customer. Satisfied until they are. It's just like each and every customer is our only customer. We're not satisfied until they are. It's just like each and every customer is our only customer. And we're not satisfied until they are. It's just like each and every customer is our only customer. And we're not satisfied until they are. It's just like each and every customer is our only customer. And we're not satisfied until they are. It's just like each and every customer is our only customer. And we're not satisfied until they are. It's just like each and every customer is our only customer. Pretty simple. TCI, may I help you?
Just one of the best hits on Movies for Guys Who Like Movies. Thursdays in June at 7:05 on TBS and TCI. Just one and me continue rave. Just one of the best hits on Movies for Guys Who Like Movies. Thursdays in June at 7:05 on TBS and TCI. Money. Everybody's running to see what you're running the casino. Power. It's like a lot of money for it. Should settle down in the family. He got the wrong guy. It was paradise on earth while it lasted. Robert De Niro, Sharon Stone, Joe Pesci. Casino, July 19th at 6 and July 23rd and 24th at 9 on USA and TCI.
The question is, how do I talk now? At TCI, we have a new philosophy. The question is, how do I talk now? At TCI, we have a new philosophy. At TCI, we have a new philosophy.
Power.
TCI, we have a new philosophy. At TCI, we have a new philosophy. At TCI, we have a new philosophy.
Power.
At TCI, we have a new philosophy. At TCI, we have a new philosophy. At TCI, we have a new philosophy.
Everybody's running to see what you're running the casino. Power. It's like a lot of money for it. Should settle down in the family. He got the wrong guy. It was paradise on earth while it lasted. Robert De Niro, Sharon Stone, Joe Pesci. Casino, July 19th at 6 and July 23rd and 24th at 9 on USA and TCI. 24th at 9 on USA and TCI. And TCI. 9 on USA and TCI. 9 on USA and Mafia. 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 Earn high pay. Meet interesting people.
She had everything a man could want.
And kill them. Earn high pay. Meet interesting people.
She had everything a man could want.
And kill them. Earn high pay. Meet interesting people.
She had everything a man could want.
And kill them. 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 Kill them. Mafia. 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 Mafia.
By the end of last week, shares of Ma Bell had fallen more than 16% since the merger was announced. We wonder why investors are so lukewarm. For an answer, we turn to Fortune writer Henry Goldblatt.
First of all, they're skeptical over AT&T's plan to integrate TCI into the company, and AT&T doesn't have a particularly good history of integrating companies. The second reason is that I think that people really think that AT&T overpaid for TCI quite a bit.
AT&T is paying a total of $48 billion for the merger, $32 billion in cash and stock, plus $16 billion in assumed debt. If you've been trying to file paying a total of $48 billion for the merger, he is paying a total of $48 billion for the merger, a total of $48 billion for the merger. He is paying a total of $48 billion for the merger. AT&T is paying a total of $48 billion for the merger, $32 billion in cash and stock, plus $16 billion in assumed debt. If you've been trying to follow TCI's stock price, remember it's listed on the NASDAQ as LBTY, as in Liberty Media it's programming on. The company listed as TCI is Transcontinental Realty Investors. Don't worry, if you're confused, you're not alone. When the AT&T merger was announced, Transcontinental Realty's trading volume was 38 times higher than average. Sure, all those people really were interested in investing in a Dallas-based real estate company.
Hello and welcome. First, the $48 billion marriage of AT&T and TCI. It is an idea that key players in the industry have been trying to pull off for years. This latest attempt will merge the United States' biggest telecommunications company and one of the largest cable TV companies. For millions of Americans, the impact could be dramatic. One-stop shopping for your telecommunication needs. That's what the chairman of AT&T and TCI promised their blockbuster deal will bring to millions of consumers. The pack could eventually provide customers with a wide range of services from a single company at a cheaper cost. Among them, long-distance and local phone service, high-speed access to the internet, cable TV service. By acquiring TCI, for the first time, AT&T will be able to put its lines into millions of American homes now connected with TCI's cables.
ET, phone home and fax and get your cable and surf the web. The eye-popping possibilities with the eye-popping $48 billion pairing of AT&T and TCI. Michael Armstrong of AT&T and John Malone of TCI are just some of those possibilities. And we've got the chairman of the American Stock Exchange, Richard Seidel. All right, who is next? That is the question that made cable stocks red hot today. Thank you, AT&T. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Neil Cavuto. It was an eye-popping deal that you heard first on Fox News last night. Ma Bell plunking down a cool $32 billion in stock, assuming another $16 billion worth of debt and some stock assumption to buy cable giant TCI. That news had folks trying to figure out which cable concern might be the next to make a connection. Well, it looks like Cablevision was the odds-on favorite, jumping more than 14 points.
I really think this will be probably the hottest stock in America, and believe me, I have been an investor in some pretty hot stocks. I really think this will be probably the hottest stock in America, and believe me, I have been an investor in some pretty hot stocks.
TCI Chairman John Malone used humor at the announcement to make his point about consumer advantages of getting all telecom services through a single line from a single company.
You know, would you like to order Viagra while you're watching your favorite entertainment show, you know? I mean, push, point, and click.
The deal may finally stop the naysayers from claiming cable companies are a dying breed.
And now with this, I guess $48 billion, if you want to include the $16 billion worth of debt, are you paying too much for an entry fee?
Well, we sure don't think so, and there's a number of ways to look at it. One would be homes passed, and when you add up the homes...
Now with this, I guess $48 billion, if you want to include the $16 billion worth of debt, are you paying too much for an entry fee?
Well, we sure don't think so, and there's a number of ways to look at it. One would be homes passed, and when you add up the homes connected and passed of TCI, plus the affiliates, we're talking about 33 million homes that we potentially have access to. That's 1/3 of America. Talking about 33 million homes that we potentially have access to. That's 1/3 of America. We're talking about 33 million homes that we potentially have access to. That's 1/3 of America. We're talking about 33 million homes that we potentially have access to. That's 1/3 of America. We're talking about 33 million homes that we potentially have access to. That's 1/3 of America.
On TCI pay-per-view. They're bold. They're brash. And they're ready to kick some butt. Ladies and gentlemen. Some butt. Ladies and gentlemen. And they're ready to kick some butt. Ladies and gentlemen. And they're ready to kick some butt. Ladies and gentlemen. And they're ready to kick some butt. Ladies and
Making you happy makes TCI happy. So making you happy makes TCI happy. So making you happy makes TCI happy. Making you happy makes TCI happy. So we're pleased to give you 3 guarantees. 1. If we miss it,
Now the Tacoma City Council is debating a plan that would allow Tacoma Power to create its own cable television company. If approved, Tacoma Power would get a 10-year franchise to compete with TCI. Many Tacoma cable customers have complained about the service TCI is providing them. TCI had another problem to deal with today. 50,000 customers lost service when a truck snagged some cable lines in Burien. It took crews most of the afternoon to fix that problem, but we're told all the affected areas from Queen Anne to Ballard, Wallingford to Georgetown all have their TVs working again. Right now, the Tacoma City Council is debating a plan that would allow Tacoma Power to create its own cable television company. If approved, Tacoma Power would get a 10-year franchise to compete with TCI. Many Tacoma cable customers have complained about the service TCI is providing them. Many Tacoma cable customers have complained about the service TCI is providing them. Many Tacoma cable customers have complained about the service TCI is providing them. Many Tacoma cable customers have complained about the service TCI is providing them. TCI had another problem to deal with today. 50,000 customers lost service when a truck snagged some cable lines in Burien. It took crews most of the afternoon to fix that problem, but we're told all the affected areas from Queen Anne to Ballard, Wallingford to Georgetown all have their TVs working again.
I
have a meaning, I suppose. I mean, I think that moment when Hitler and Himmler and Heydrich were laughing together about the mass murder they were killing out, they were carrying out, I think that discloses in some way a Hitler who was not crazy, who was not driven by some syndrome, but a Hitler who was consciously evil, knew what he was doing was wrong, and relished it and laughed about it. There's one philosopher, actually, Beryl Lang, who I think actually came up with a term that may be the closest to what I believe can be said about Hitler, that Hitler created an art of evil, that he was a failed artist in his youth, but he was in some way at heart an artist.
People too, from the way the uniform looked, right, to the color, you said black, gray, and the stiletto kind of shoes, they would stand up straight, they was forcing you to stand up straight. All that was part of that.
Yeah, I think you're onto something here because, I mean, you know, it's what Beryl Lang called the artistry of evil.
I mean, you know, the Third Reich was a designer hell, you know, I mean, he really planned out everything from the smallest details, he said, the colors of the uniform, the shapes of the phalanxes of troops, the music, you know, it was, unfortunately, the work of a demonic artist. The Third Reich was a designer hell, you know, I mean, you know, the Third Reich was a designer hell, you know, I mean, the Third Reich was a designer hell.
Style and elegance, easy to recognize, hard to define.
What is it about? There's something revolving. But when we come, the world keeps revolving. They say the next big thing is that the revolution. But to me it seems like that it's all just a little bit of history repeated.
More than any other time in history, trends today come fast and furious. Is it long or short? Loose or tight? Uptown or downtown? Reined in or over the top?
Just take a shout and you're silent. But they don't know if it's coming our way. There is fashion, there is fashion. And the joke is around the set. That it's all just a little bit of history.
So join us for the next 2 hours as we show you the latest and greatest, clear things up a bit, and make a little history of our own by going straight to the front lines of the fashion revolution.
To enjoy from the man to the boy, till the day, till the joy. If I said the little bits of history repeating.
Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Historic Television Event, the World Fashion Premiere from Paris. Paris, city of life. Paris, city of love. Paris, a place of such tremendous beauty that attracts some 50 million visitors every year, making it the most popular place on the planet. Something that has always been done in Paris is fashion. Like politics in Washington or cinema in Los Angeles, fashion dominates Paris. And the best of the best are the haute couture collections we bring you this evening. You'll see Donatella Versace's first haute couture collection 1 year after the tragic death of her brother, Gianni. John Galliano's drama. You'll see Donatella Versace's first haute couture collection 1 year after the tragic death of her brother, Gianni. You'll see Donatella Versace's first haute couture collection 1 year after the tragic death of her brother, Gianni. You'll see Donatella Versace's first haute couture collection 1 year after the tragic death of her brother, Gianni.
straight from the runways of Paris into your living rooms. So let's get started. Our first outfit is bright, bold, body-conscious, and unapologetically sexy. And while fashion is always quoted as famous, Versace raised its stakes of the game, coming out with a high-energy mix of clients that range from rock and roll to royalty, from Prince to the Princess of Wales, Elizabeth Hurley to Courtney Love, John Bon Jovi to Madonna.
I'm still like a baby play with fashion, playing life. I'm very like Valentino.
Last summer, after presenting his couture collection here in Paris, Versace flew to his Miami mansion for a much-needed holiday and wrote this.
Good evening. We begin with Murder in Miami. He was one of the world's most influential fashion designers. Gianni Versace was murdered in broad daylight this morning, just as he was returning from an ordinary trip to the museum.
The world was shocked. The closely knit Versace family was plunged into mourning, where the future of the Versace empire, with almost $1 billion in annual sales, hung in the balance. The tough job of carrying the house forward fell to the designer's closest collaborator, his grief-stricken sister, Donatella. The importance of Versace placing in couture and the skill required to create it, Donatella delayed her first couture show until now. In fact, she's not even been back to Paris since their final days together here last summer. Many of Donatella's friends turned out to show their support, including actress Melanie Griffith.
She was murdered. Versace 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 was murdered.
With the tension building and more of Donatella's high-voltage
Versace was murdered. 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 She was murdered. Versace 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 was murdered. She was murdered. Versace 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 was murdered. Lee 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 Versace murdered. Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace was
Say hello to my little friend. Consider a career in the mob. Learn new skills. Earn high pay. Real interesting people.
She had everything a man could want.
Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace murdered. Lee Versace was 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 murdered. It was murdered. Lee Versace 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 was murdered. She was murdered. Lee Versace was murdered. She was murdered. Lee Versace 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 was murdered.
This is your next record. You were talking to Army about a week. How much longer are you going to be in the studio?
Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace
Well, I got a note from a logo on my birthday, and it said, Fox has Universal. I mean, Fox has James Cameron, and Universal has you.
Lee Versace was murdered. Lee Versace was murdered.
And Titanic of Rock is what it is. You know, you gotta hear it. It's, if you don't like it, you're kind of dumb.
Somebody's getting kind of a California sheen to it.
That sort of tradition of like Rumors and X and the Doors and the Beach Boys, and I wanted to go into that tradition. And if you write about California, you don't have to write about Seattle, and then you can subtext everything, and then you don't have, you're not selling yourself out. Did it bring in outside? So what do you mean, like an Alanis thing? Like bringing in like Glenn Ballard? You're like having someone write for me? No! But I did write with like, you know, a couple friends, and our band did, and we got some real help from people, like Billy, which is what you want to ask. What's your afraid?
I knew personally that they were having a hard time. So I kind of came up with the notion of, well, why don't you just give me a month or so, and let me just see if I can have an AI, so to speak, and just kind of get the whole record going.
I could have made this record if you hadn't got me off my ass. Eric and Melissa did, and I was tired, and I was shopping at the Gap, and I didn't know what I was anymore.
What's that voice? Versace was murdered. Versace was murdered. Versace was murdered. Versace was murdered.
Dynamic that I had never experienced with him because I had to be submissive
Versace was murdered.
to his whims, and it made my head bleed, but I learned a lot. And he's kind of like, he was like a math teacher that would give me the answer, so that was the torture of it. Well, just tell me. No, I'm not writing this for you.
You had to learn it for yourself.
And I'd go in the bathroom and just, I'd be like, just Billy, just tell me, because you know how to do that. Half-key Beatles thing, what? And then he would make me kind of do some of it myself.
Looking forward to getting out there and doing these lives.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Let me just see if to you. And if you miss me, if you decide that it's not working out, please, you know what? I'll go to Montana.
Versace was murdered. 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 Versace was murdered.
Looking guy with the silly mustache and the hair combed over to the side and not tall and not even German, right?
Austrian, yeah.
What do we learn?
I guess, one thing we can learn is to listen to people who warn about people like Hitler. I mean, the Munich Post journalist in 1931 came upon and published Hitler's secret plans to murder Jews, in which Hitler even used the name, the phrase, the horrible euphemism, the final solution. They published it in a German newspaper that everyone could read, and no one paid attention. They were Cassandra-like. They were doomed to know the truth, but no one would listen. And so I guess, one lesson anyway is don't ignore when the truth about people like this is being pumped.
Was Eva Braun the love of his life?
Most people say that she was less important than Gayle Robbel, that the death of Gayle Robbel, I mean, there's a whole school of thinking, which I somewhat disparage, that, after the death, suicide, murder, whatever, of Gayle Robbel in 1931, whatever shreds of humanity might have been left in Hitler were gone.
Love of his life?
Most people say that she was less important than Gayle Robbel, that the death of Gayle Robbel, I mean, there's a whole school of thinking, which I somewhat disparage, that, after the death, suicide, murder, whatever, Robbel, that the death of Gayle Robbel, I mean, there's a whole school of thinking, which I somewhat disparage, that, after the death, suicide, murder, whatever, People say that she was less important than Gayle Robbel, that the death of Gayle Robbel, I mean, there's a whole school of thinking, which I somewhat disparage, that, after the death, suicide, murder, whatever, people say that she was less important than Gayle Robbel, that the death of Gayle Robbel, I mean, there's a whole school of thinking, which I somewhat disparage, that, after the death, suicide, murder, whatever,
The love of his life?
Most people say that she was less important than Gayle Robbel, that the death of Gayle Robbel, I mean, there's a whole school of thinking, which I somewhat disparage, that, after the death, suicide, murder, whatever, of Gayle Robbel in 1931, whatever shreds of humanity might have been left in Hitler were gone. I disparage this as the no more Mr. Nice Guys here. There wasn't a nice guy. After the death, suicide, murder, whatever,
Hello, I'm Richard Lee. Quote, Richard Lee, a Channel 29 stalwart, and host of the long-running Kurt Cobain Was Murdered show. This dyspeptic, self-styled PI has become our favorite post-JFK conspiracy nut. He tirelessly campaigns against Courtney, the Seattle Police Department, and all the other ignoramuses who stand in the way of his path to justice, which turns out to be a very, very long list. We can't get enough of his condescension and peevish drawl, especially after those distended vowels, as he reads his windy manifestos and vents his inexhaustible spleen. Finally, as David Letterman mellows into late career fatigue, we've found a compelling new TV personality who loves to hate. And these are words from a back-page article this week from Seattle's primary news weekly, generally known as the Seattle, Weekly, News, Weekly. Well, if I told you so, and don't say I didn't warn you weren't enough of catchphrases defining this program's approach, we now find ourselves in need of a new, somewhat extremely Schwarzeneggian turn of the tongue to give a tentative adios amigo, or something about something being terminated, or an assurance that we'll be back, or, quite possibly not. In fact, we are not even sure that we are here now. Quite possibly, this week's program may suffer the same fate as last week's, that is, that corporate bullies' desires to assert rather instinctively that they make the law around here, and that any free speech advocate and radicals can just go wipe their tears on any spare copy of the Bill of Rights may prevail. Yes, after 223 weeks of continuous editions aired over this channel on this subject, the DiMaggio-like streak we've enjoyed of never having aired a subpar program ever during any of the last 11 score and then some weeks was brought to a halt by an entry-level employee, or in fact at least 3 of them working together, who are obviously acting with the endorsement of their superiors to muck with the program as much as they could in any way they could, which in this case concerned an outright lie about the time that the program was delivered, to assert that it was not on time and therefore would not air. So who could have expected much more from the Cable Cosa Nostra, TCI, especially now bolstered by their apparent acquisition by that corp known as the Death Star, known by that name even by its own employees, and this the pesty maritime city on the shore of the disease-covered Puget Sound. Why do they do what they do? Well, because they are the cold-blooded cable company, moronic by design and especially in execution. Really just asks them sometime why it is that they are such perpetual screw-ups, and chances are they'll tell you just that. Complete and utter mental incompetence, simple-mindedness, slow-wittedness, moral retardation. And that's why they're running the cable company, because any way you or they look at it, it is the job which most closely matches the description could be done just as well by a trained chimpanzee. Really, just ask them, they'll tell you. There is, of course, also that rather Quailian aspect to the job that so many of these Lancelot Link stand-ins relish so greatly. That is the political intrigue factor, wherein people who rarely string together a complete sentence of more than a dozen words get to play bully boys for their masters, putting so much effort into trying to chain so as to jerk the chain of anyone who has a mind to function as if the city's lackey corporation's lackeys didn't hold some authority over one's exercise of their First Amendment rights. Is it any wonder the rumors that so many of the employees have aspirations of joining the police department? If they do succeed in hassling us off the air after this very successful run, and you are left wondering, well, as Ham's dad said, remember me, and remember this, dodge the question or falsify an answer to this question as they may, we all know that it is completely obvious that what goes on in this public access television station occurs almost exclusively of any other considerations because the political culture, the administration inside of City Hall in Seattle, wants it that way. That is where the responsibility resides and where blame must be ascribed. And I'm Richard Lee, and once again, thank you for joining us. Hopefully, we'll be back on the air again next week. Hopefully, we're on the air this week. There will, of course, be no live presentation this evening, because that is an extent of censorship that is most certainly occurring this evening. But once again, thanks for your attention, and hopefully, talk to you soon.